Welcome to Let's Be Perfectly Queer, a queer podcast creating space to talk about all things queer. My name is Archie, and I'm joined today by Lee, Pivnick, and Nicolas Baird.
Questions of how you identify, seeking answers to clarify. Whether you're queen
or somewhere in between, let's be perfectly queer.
Hello.
Hi, thanks for having us, Archie.
Thank you very much for jumping on. And on today's episode, of course, I just mentioned we're joined by Lee and Nicolas, two of the co-founders of the Institute of Queer Ecology. Together, they explore the fascinating intersection of queerness and the natural world. We'll be talking about what queer ecology is, why it matters, and how looking at nature through a queer lens can change the way we think about identity, biodiversity, and our place in the world. Welcome to the show.
Amazing. We're super excited to be here. Thanks for having us.
Thank you. I've never heard about ecology, so when I got the email, I was like, what is this? You know, sometimes you think you know a lot about the world, and then you're like, what's queer ecology? But for people who are hearing it for the first time, just like I did, what is it? What is queer ecology?
It's a good question. I think like the easiest and first thing that comes to mind is like, okay, I know what queer is, I know what ecology is, but how are these things going together? And there's a million different ways of answering that. Maybe we'll just talk about a couple today.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
I think it's helpful to think about queer ecology as going both ways. Because we're both queering a kind of practice of ecology, of biology, of the environmental sciences. We're thinking about when these sciences were becoming knowledge bases, who was left out of that creation process, and how that tinges how it gets taught, how it gets withheld is also, knowledge, and often really interesting political knowledge. And so part of it, of course, is bringing a queer approach to these kind of academic spaces. But then it also goes the other way, and we try to think about like what in our queer communities, which often so much is shaped by like nightlife and indoor spaces, and like when we go out into the field, when we go out into the world together, how can we see ourselves differently in light of the kind of experiences of other species?
I think queer theory is a lot about like how we relate to ourselves and to other people. And ecology is such a relational science. It's about how things fit into this web of like interrelations. And so there's sort of this harmony there already from the beginning about like relationality being a really key part of queerness and ecology. And then when you start to maybe at a like entry level, queer ecology can be like, there's gay swans. And then there's like there's other levels too and other ways of thinking about it. And maybe thinking a way that's interesting to me right now to think about queer ecology is like thinking about the sort of rules and traditions and mindsets that were handed and saying like, how can we blend and blur and break these in generative ways? How can we think outside of the box that's still within this like big web? That's
very cool. You could literally spend 45 minutes just talking about that definition of the word. But what first drew the both of you into this field?
It's a good question.
We met in our adult life, but I think both of us have stories of like growing up in really biodiverse spaces. I am from Florida, from the areas near the Everglades, and I would go down and do wildlife photography when I was like in middle school because it felt like real life Pokemon to me to like get into birding. It was like this like really like expansive world of biodiversity that like I was just nerding out on, and environmental storytelling kind of came first out of just like a love for that environment. And the more time I spent in those spaces, the more time you kind of also desire seeing yourself and your community in them. And so often I think a lot of like environmental spaces, they kind of skew older, they skew white, they skew straight. And like, I think finding ways to intentionally like bring a diverse approach to looking at those environments together was really desiring to me. But also like that environmental storytelling route always continued. And I was always interested in art, and making art primarily is my way of like taking in the world and processing it and putting it back out. And all of this was like flushing around in my head a little bit when I had the fortune of meeting Nick out in Arizona.
I grew up in Arizona. We met there. I grew up in the Sonoran Desert, so super different ecosystems that we're from. But we both have this like deep love of the landscape and spent a lot of time in it when we were young. But I think that I was sort of I share some resonances with Lee's earlier story, but I'll talk actually a bit later in life. I was doing my undergrad in history of science, and I was interested in the ways that we teach evolution and look at like biology as the narratives that we teach biology with, and particularly in the context of art and thinking about visual pedagogy. And I got really interested in this sort of like, I didn't want to make a choice between doing art and doing science. And I was like, sort of put my foot down and was like, no, I want to stay right here, right at the fork of the road. And I thought that would be, I didn't know how that would be possible. And it's been many years now since then, and it has been possible. But queer ecology is one of the places that really allows that type of work to exist. It's like just science on its own. One of the ways that science exists and allows itself to exist is by creating boundaries around itself and around other things. And one of the ways that art works is to like be omnivorous, to like eat everything and try everything. And those two things coming together in one space is sort of what we're trying to do, is like think about the ways that we learn about the world and look at the world through a scientific lens. And then how do we like expand and push that out, queer ecology.
And because they do say that art and science belong together, there's been lots of arguments here in Australia with education, and they have a thing called STEM. Have you heard of STEM before? And then, so there's a big push like, well, why is it not STEAM? Because art should be with the sciences and that kind of stuff. So it's just interesting when you were saying that. I was like, yeah, arts and science do belong together. Anyway, I'm digressing. Was there a particular moment, like with the arts and science, that you realized ecology and queerness belonged in the same conversation?
What comes to mind for me, I think, is...
It all goes back to the gay swans. No, go ahead, Lee. I'd say something more serious.
No, I mean, I think of when Nick and I started working together and collaborating for the first time, because we both had these kind of ideas percolating in our practices, in our heads, but not a real community of people that were working at the intersection of it. And really, I think finding each other's interests in that allowed us to kind of open up and explore it more. And so we, in 2017, had the idea to put out a publication that was kind of just like an unbound group of ideas from people all over that we put a call out for on Instagram, and we sent a bunch of emails, and we were making the project the Institute of Queer Ecology for the first time. And we were wondering what an Institute of Queer Ecology could be. And the first thing that was clear was that like ecology and like queerness, it's relational. It's a network of people that are working in different spaces, that are working in different ways, but that can like illuminate what these methods and ideas can come together as. And so I think we tried to first make a project that felt like a queer ecology, that felt like a bringing together and like defining of survival strategies that could be useful for queer people and for other species alike, as we were all navigating 2017, which was of course a real turning point in the US politically. Yeah, I think like it comes through our conversations with each other. Of course, we were like reading a bunch of interesting books at the time. Bruce Bagameel's like incredible text, Biological Exuberance, which is this book that like really brought together 500 examples from across the natural world of other species that were observed to be having some kind of same-sex relations or changing their gender as part of their natural life cycle. And it starts to detail these things that had been kind of like purposefully omitted from like scientific publishing for the past like 100 years. And it opened up the conversation that then like sprawled into all of these other areas for sure.
I think it's hard to answer that question because for me, at least, it wasn't really a moment, but like a slow realizing over time of like, oh, this is a way that you can sort of think and have it bring to every part of life if you want to, this sort of like openness and empathy and compassion for other species and for other people. And it's not something that's unique to queer ecology, but it's definitely like a framework of ideas and tools for understanding the world around us.
Yeah. And we hear it all the time. You hear it, you see it on the social media, you hear it in the news, people saying, especially as queer individuals, that it's not natural. They say it all the time that, you know, especially when talking about political environments and what's going on and creating bills and laws, and a lot of religions, they use that argument, it's not natural. Where do you think that idea comes from?
Yeah, good question. Pointing fingers. I think maybe, okay, so on the one hand, we have a long tradition, at least in the West, of heteronormative patriarchy that it's like, we know that, and maybe not so exciting to get into the details of that and where we've come from there. But I think something that we've been thinking about lately and are really excited by is this idea of maybe a synonym for unnatural being like deviant, and the sense of like deviancy, both in terms of like sexual deviancy, but also deviating from expectations, cultural norms in a very broad way, not just about sexuality. And something that we keep coming back to is this idea that like all evolutionary progress or like development or adaptation, the biodiversity that we see in the world is caused by mutations in genomes, which are a form of deviation from the norm. That is like very much a part of the natural order of things, if you want to use the word natural or unnatural. And it's a really exciting thing to like look around at the like rich, beautiful world and say like all of these are like deviant accidents. It's really exciting.
I think it's a really effective argument, like, to deploy the natural. I think it's succeeded for a while for many people. And I think that because there's a real strength in nature, but also, like, when you start to think about natural and nature and you just dive deeper and deeper into it, like I'm speaking to you today through a computer, through a system of like telecommunication cables, feels like the most unnatural thing, all totally derived from like materials in the universe. At what point does like a stone become ore, become tool, become unnatural, become like as it gets shaped? We're doing this project now called The Unnatural, a semester-long course with the Institute for Postnatural Studies. And their ideas of post-nature, I think, really shape also how we like approach this. It'll be like a semester throughout the fall that Nick and I are co-teaching with an artist in Madrid, Yuri Tuma, and a bunch of lovely people. But when I think of the natural, I think of strengths and limitations of arguing within the natural. There's a moment at the end of Bruce Baghamill's book that I was just mentioning where they talk about the use of the red cockaded woodpecker, which is this endangered species in the southern part of the US. And it was used as an argument for an expansion of the Endangered Species Act in the 90s. And what they needed to do was convince a holdout Republican senator of the value of protecting this woodpecker habitat. And the way they sold it to him was through a fact about the woodpecker, that they mate for life. And because of this, they're, upstanding citizens in our state, and a model that we can look to and point people to as a model of moral authority. And he buys it and passes it and says, this whole thing about the celebration of the woodpecker because of its life. And in this argument, they leave out that the woodpeckers, I think, eat a quarter of their babies, which is just something else that they do as well that is natural to them. And like that nature, when you like look at it closely, you realize it is beautiful and it's queer, but it's violent and it's contradictory. And like you can point to whatever you're trying to argue in the natural world because it's so incredibly biodiverse. And so I think we don't look to other species as like an argument for the moral high ground and like a full refutation of it, but you have to kind of go a step further and point out the like unnaturalness of arguing the natural argument.
I was recently watching a video on Facebook about the spider, and it lays all these eggs, and once the eggs hatch, these little baby spiders eat the mum, and then it'll eat all the other spiders in the web. It's quite interesting that when you have people arguing that it's unnatural, but something as vicious as eating your own mum and your uncle and your dad, nobody sees a problem with that. When you put it into that kind of perspective, it can be a little bit silly. And it's so interesting that people who argue that being LGBTQIA+ is unnatural has no qualms or won't even bat an eye about that.
There's the popular slogan that homosexuality and queerness, it exists, ubiquitously throughout the natural world, but homophobia is only in one species. That the kind of like way that we respond to behaviors is unique and unnatural.
When you start bringing in birds and spiders and fish and other species that are beyond the primate, maybe the primate family tree, which is also behaviorally very diverse, then the like logical fallacy or the like silliness, I guess, it's more fun to say silliness of like comparing one species' way of being to another is like you have this spider that they'll eat their moms, and then you have another spider. I was reading, actually also looking at some spider stuff this week. I was really entertained by a picture of an illustration of a spider where the females are very large and the males are very small. And this one was their mating ritual involves the male like binding the female's pedipalps with web before they mate. And the way that the caption described it was like male binds older virgin female. It was very much like BDSM cougar, inexperienced cougar. Like it just sort of felt like if we try to put these like human labels on it, it becomes very silly very fast, but in a kind of playful way. And I think there's a lot of play when you start talking about other animals and sex. I mean, hopefully many of our audience has seen the Isabella Rossellini web series, Green Porno, which is, I think, one of the best communications about animal sex that's ever been made. They're really delightful. If you haven't seen them, look them up.
Never heard of it, but I need to check this out.
Yeah, she's like dressing up as different species and enacting it in like through like wild performance, multi-species drag.
That sounds so good. And then you also you mentioned fish and Finding Nemo, right? Let's look at Finding Nemo and the fact that in the real natural world, he would have transitioned to be a a female.
I cannot wait for the remake.
Yeah.
We might have to make it ourselves, but
I was literally saying they got Finding Nemo wrong. He should have transitioned straight away. Like, what happened? It should have been a mum. But anyway, talking about that, could you share some of your favorite examples of sexual or gender diversity in nature? Like, I love the Finding Nemo kind of thing and having that in an argument. But what do you have that is kind of your favorite?
Lee, before you get into fish, because I know you're going to talk about fish, if you want to, I want to talk briefly about primates because I dismissed them earlier. But I think often we sort of look at like the best studied of the primates, I think, are probably the chimpanzees. They're the ones that have the longest history of scientific research. We often use them as like a model of what they're our closest living relatives. And so we look at them for advice in a very vague sort of way. But they're super violent. They're like unbelievably violent species and really aggressive, and they'll kill each other. And it's like, that's a model. And I think that's like, it's very easy to look at that and be like, yes, and so are we. And like, it's inherent in our nature. And then you turn one step away to the bonobos, which are as closely related to us as we are to chimpanzees, because they're sisters. And the bonobos are like free sex, women, men and men, like changing partners. They greet each other by doing oral sex on each other. Like when the males are nervous, they'll grab each other's penises. It's like, they're so different than chimpanzees, and they just haven't been studied as much. And so they're like less in the public mind. They're less used as this sort of like model for human behavior. But it's funny that we have these like two siblings, if we want to really reduce it, the like violent and the horny. And like we've chosen to look at the violent one as our model. And I'm like, what if we also add a little bit of the horny in? That could be fun, no? That's all I have to say about primates.
we literally like don't put bonobos in zoos because they're too horny. But like violent is okay for public display. But of course I want to talk about fish. Finding Nemo, like the example you just gave with the clownfish, for those who don't know at home, like clownfish, there's like the largest clownfish is the like alpha female. And if anything happens to her, like it did in Finding Nemo, the second largest clownfish in the group, because all of the other clownfish are male, will then transition into a female. It's the inverse actually of what I was thinking earlier of parrotfish, who are these beautiful, beautiful, like most like dazzling things on our reefs here in Florida. And they all go through, like, they all have different colorways, and the colors change based on their like age, sex, gender. They're like the like stoplight parrotfish are these like beautiful red, black, and white ones. And they're either born male or female, but then all of the females eventually become male later in life. And some of the ones that are born male and the ones that become male have totally different reproductive strategies. And it like, if you take one step next to them in like the other parrotfish, to the rainbow parrotfish, they have like, again, totally different reproductive strategies and behaviors. And so there's just like such a diversity in this like very flashy group of fish that they come to mind immediately as like both exhibiting kind of a fluidity in sex, but also the, like same-sex behaviors when it comes to reproduction in different ways. But then like underneath the fish, which like is much more important, I think, as a metaphor and a way to understand queerness, is the coral itself. And like the coral is exhibiting a different kind of queer behavior that I think Nick and I have been like talking about extensively in the past few years, which is mutualism. And this is like beyond sex and gender. How can we think about queerness in a more than human way that like really starts to feel more behaviors that we do maybe day to day? I think of mutual living together in close and strange partnerships. The corals are only possible to evolve in this way through their like sustained partnerships with zooxanthellae algae. And like the whole reef is then rooted in this mutualism where like the algae is able to be growing in like the safety and security of the coral itself. The coral derives some of its food from the algae, and you have this arrangement where their partnership is then this like foundational building block for the most biodiverse systems in the ocean. And then when we talk about coral bleaching now, what we're talking about is like a breakup between those two partners, where the like stress conditions of the water put so much pressure on the coral polyps that they eject their partner and then lose their ability to eat. And so a bleached coral is not a dead coral, it's one that's like starving in the loss of its partner. And I also like want to showcase in this metaphor is that's like one of the more important things in coral science today is understanding the relationship of this partnership to what extent like heat stresses and climate change is impacting it. But the discovery of that importance of the zooxanthellae mutualism comes from a queer woman who was in marine science, Ruth Gates, who ran this incredible lab out in Hawaii and is credited with discovering this. And I think it's then a reminder that different life experiences can yield different ways of looking at the same problems. And that, like, to look at the world as a system of mutualisms instead of something like what social Darwinism teaches us, that like a world of competition driving evolution. These kind of cooperative and mutualistic strategies that are inherent to queer survival can then imagine and reconsider how the other species in the world might be relating to each other as well.
Are there examples that completely changed how you think about biology before you're going into studying or delving further into the world of queer ecology?
Yes, definitely. I'm going to piggyback off of what Lee was just talking about, actually, and go down the mutualism route for a second. I think there's sort of two big ones that I think on the surface, it's like not obvious that they're queer, but to me they are, and I'll try to explain why, and maybe I'll convince you, maybe I won't. But I think one of them is the idea of endosymbiosis or symbiogenesis, both of these sort of referring to not exactly the same phenomenon, but we can talk about them in the same system, which is the early engulfment of mitochondria-like bacterium by another bacterium or by another single-celled organism. And so this is like the basis of all animal life today, is that we have these mitochondria inside of our cells that have their own DNA. They reproduce on their own schedule and timeline. They come down from our mothers and not from our fathers. They like act differently than the rest of our organelles, the like organs inside of our cells. And the hypothesis that has now been pretty much accepted was put forth, I think, in the 70s. Maybe I'm off on my timeline. Maybe it was a little bit later, by Lynn Margulis, who was basically, her theory was, okay, if these two organisms came together, one living inside the other, that mutualism allowed them to do something new, which was this multicellular way of life. We also see it with chloroplasts, the things in plants that allow them to produce sugars. Sorry, I'm trying to not go too deep into I'm doing my PhD in evolutionary biology right now, so I'm trying not to go too deep into it. I'll try to stay at a podcast level. But the point of what I'm trying to say is that this like union or communion between two totally different branches of the tree of life coming together and like living inside of each other allowed a like whole new branch of life to appear. Which is the like multicellular life that we know today. Everything that is multicellular, basically, that's alive is from this union. And that's only possible because of this like intense intimacy. And I think when you start talking about intimacy, when you're talking about like communion and union, things are getting queer already in the biological sciences. But okay, so let's set that aside for a second and keep going a little farther. One of the things that I'm like totally blown away by in biology now is horizontal gene transfer. The idea that like bacteria, basically this works better with single-celled organisms, but you can see it in some multicellular organisms as well. But basically take bacterium there's different branches, like different domains, the very root level of how life has evolved. Take one on like the very far over here branch and then one very far over here branch. I'm gesturing, but it doesn't matter where I'm gesturing, just that they're really far apart for those listening at home. And those two bacteria, which have nothing in common except for like way, way, way back in time, they shared an ancestor, something like even farther apart than we are from a fungus or from a plant. Like they're super far apart. They can just give each other DNA. They can just say like, hey, I figured out how to like survive this antibiotic. Do you want it? And the other bacteria will be like, sure, hand it over. And then they can just give each other parts of themselves, like the very fabric of what makes them what they are. They can just pass around. And that feels to me like extremely queer and extremely cool and is like radical. It's a radical way of living to like be able to do that sort of transfer. Yeah, it's something that I'm like really fascinated by and like a proponent of like this queer ecology, horizontal gene transfer.
Wait, I've got a really simple wrap up to that thought, which is that like Nick and I constantly are talking about how if I can give you one quick fact, there's more non-human cells in our bodies than human cells. Our gut biomes, the like rich biodiversity we have bacterially, is outnumbering our humanness. And so when we think about ourselves as these like very staunch separated things from the world and forget that we're animals, We're just like a walking amalgamation of all kinds of different little bugs.
I mean, even if you just think about the mitochondria, every single one of our cells is already a symbiosis. We're already in mutualism at the cellular level.
I'm learning a lot. This is great. And how might queer ecology change the way we approach conservation or environmental issues? Because this is all kind of linking in. How do you feel that it will change the way we approach it?
Okay, Lee, can I jump in here? We talked about this one a bit earlier. We were sort of like trying to think about different ways of answering it. This just came to me, so this is a little spontaneous. But I think that what we've been talking about, this idea of like coral and the relationships that they have, life histories of parrotfish, the like horizontal gene transfer among bacteria, all of the ways that we're talking about these organisms is giving them agency over their lives. We're interested in the way that they live, not because we're trying to figure out if it like fits within a human moral framework or whether or not it's right or wrong or whether or not they're doing it in a good way or a bad way. We're trying to understand how things live by giving attention and observing and thinking and like looking at and trying to accept what is there rather than like to put a narrative that you have brought to the world onto it. You give those things their own agency. And I think that like when you start by giving everything around you and everything that we're in this sort of big network of the like world with agency, then you start to like accept it as another form of being that's equal to our own. And I think that that's a really important place to start with when you're talking about conservation. The species that we're on Earth with are sharing this Earth, and like the future that is best for humans is not the future that is going to be best for a lot of species on Earth. And there are some species for whom the future, their like ideal future may be a future without humans. And those are like, I don't know, that it's the openness to those possibilities of what other sorts of futures might be possible or desirable by other beings, maybe even large beings like ecosystems or the world that like have their own sort of desires and agencies and futures that they might want, which conflict with our own or some of the ones that some people want. And so it's worth thinking about those conversations and trying to maybe give voice to those things that don't have a voice in like human policy making, whether that's an orca whale or a river or a forest.
Yeah. And that a lot of these ways that we've approached conservation historically is, of course, thinking very human decisions. The like early creation of many of the national parks in the US were also rooted in acts of land disposition from different indigenous groups. And so the thinking about actually if the animal you're trying to preserve needs something is often secondary to how we're actually trying to preserve them. I think of how marine protected areas for different whales and different things are only qualify when the species that you're trying to protect is within this kind of bordered off part of the ocean for these like large migrating animals that move in and out of protection. And so if the goal is to protect it, you'd have to think about not a staunch border-based way of looking at the world that we've constructed for us for much peril, but like a fluid one that like matches the like necessary migration as a sacred and life right for so many creatures.
And that's something that we can't even really get right for people yet. So
no, we're talking about the need for like a multi-species democracy when like one single species democracy isn't barely surviving in a lot of places.
Yeah.
And
the right for free migration and free movement around the world.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard. It's a tricky one.
Yeah.
Have you watched the animation Hoppers by any chance?
I just did.
Oh, great. Good. I'm glad I haven't seen it yet. So I'm glad you have, Lee.
Yes, I saw it like 4 days ago.
That's in my mind when you were saying, you need a representative from each kind of species in nature. For those who don't know, they have like all of your bugs have a representative and a king, and they all come together in a court. If only we had some kind of way to communicate with the other organisms and everything else, and let's all get together and create a world democracy. Who knows? 100 years down the track, there might be some translators. Who knows?
Excellent.
Yeah, I mean, we are so at just the frontier of like trying to understand how other species can have a voice and agency in the world, in our modern world, because I think when you go back in time, a lot of these ways of thinking about queerness and thinking about other species become as baseline to knowledge systems and spiritual practices as we're like, this could be a utopic way of living. And it's like, was so much like the baseline of many belief systems around the world.
Before I get to my last question, with your Institute of Queer Ecology, you mentioned that you're working on something right now. Did you want to quickly touch on that?
Sure. Well, we have an exhibition on view right now that it feels actually like the publication project I mentioned earlier. This feels like the older sibling of it. It's an exhibition for the Climate Biennial Klima Biennale in Vienna, Austria, and it's on view. I don't know if we've announced an extension yet, but there's rumor that it will be up a little longer. Take it away.
It was supposed to close in early August, but it may be extended, which is exciting. But it's a really dense show, and like this sort of project we were describing earlier, we invited a lot of different contributors, not just artists, but also scientists and writers and performers and musicians, and it's a really like diverse cast of voices, all responding to this sort of larger question of we're thinking about climate and climate change, and one of the things that comes to our minds first is biodiversity loss as a sort of like major symptom of climate change, maybe like one of the most heartbreaking. And that sort of like sense of loss, of like extinction of things falling out of alignment with each other, of like, for example, an insect that pollinates a flower that like with global warming, the insects hatch earlier, the flowers hatch later, they miss each other. The fruit doesn't get made, and then everything that eats the fruit in the ecosystem doesn't have much food. There's sort of this like cascade of loss just from this one missed connection. These like missed connections and loss and heartbreak, it's like echoes the language that we use when we talk about personal heartbreak and relationships, and when you're at the right place at the wrong time or with the right person in the wrong moment of your life. That like those two different forms of heartache seem to really be, they're very close, at least in my heart, to each other. And this show, it's called I Wish We Had More Time. And it's about these sorts of like large scale ecological collapse and the like very small scale personal intimate losses that feel like as enormous in an individual life as these sort of big things do. And like they're happening all around us at all scales all the time. So the show seems like it's sort of a sad show on the surface. It's thinking about loss and thinking about grief and heartbreak, but it actually has turned out into this sort of really joyful, and like it is a bit poignant. There's some sadness to it, but there's a ton of joy, and this like big collective working and like thinking about and responding to these questions is a big part of that, I think. Like when we do and make stuff together, rarely doing and making things together ends in sadness. It usually ends in joy.
That's very true. And if people wanted to get in touch or see what else you're doing, if they're not in Austria, where can they get in contact with you guys?
Our whole archive lives on our website. And so we have projects listed there, everything from past films we've done to workshops, like I mentioned, with the Institute for Post-Natural Studies that we're doing again this fall. And I believe registration for it is still open for a few more weeks. It will be a really special one. We're doing a program on, at the very end of it, we're making a kind of radio show together and thinking about sound ecologies and how other species are, of course, communicating vocally. And how oral histories can live on. And so online is where we'll be, and online is where we are most often. Nick and I are the co-directors of the project, but we live in New York and Miami, respectively, right now. And so I think next year we hope to bring the work back to our hometowns for our 10-year anniversary. But until then, you can find us online at queerecology.org or on Instagram at queerecology, although DMs are a black hole. Find us on email if you want to get in touch.
Yeah, awesome. And to finish this episode, what's one misconception you'd love people to leave behind after listening today?
Okay, I have not a real answer because I don't think it's actually a misconception. But the main thing, the like big point for me is that queer ecology is so much more than just gay swans. That like there's like a whole way of thinking about and like changing perspectives, and it's about thinking about the world as a relational place and thinking about other species and other people with empathy. That's it for me.
For me, it's like, I think what it's taught me first is, like, as a queer person, you're not alone. Like, even when you feel alone in, like, solitude, in a rural space, in a place far from queer community, there is, like, a broad, living, vibrant world that, like, you can find community within. And I thought that was a niche to, like, be looking at that world in the sciences and in the arts. And more through this project and through the collaborations we've had with other people, we've worked with like over 200 artists at this point, artists, scientists, expanded how they would describe their practices. But like, I think getting really deep into this niche then like felt not like a narrowing in, but then an expanding out. And so, yeah, that the community that you're looking for in the human world and the more than human world is just a few steps away.
Yeah, that's awesome. So thank you both, Lee and Nicholas. Thank you for joining and sharing your insights and information about queer ecology and beyond. It's been really interesting, and I hope that the listeners have learned something new. I've learned a lot just from this quick conversation, so I hope that they have really enjoyed it as much as I have. So thank you so much. If you want to get in touch with either Lee or Nicholas or find out what they're doing, I'll post all of their links and their socials in the show notes. But if you did enjoy this episode, don't forget to follow the podcast, follow Lee, Nick at Queer Ecology, Instagram, I'll put it down there, and leave us a review. Share it with someone who you think would love it, or your angry aunt who believes that being LGBTQ+ isn't natural. And until next time, I hope that we have been
Perfectly
Queer.
Let's be perfectly queer.